All right. Thank you all again for joining. Welcome to tonight's virtual panel discussion on identity and inclusion in non-monogamous communities. Tonight's event is part of the Week of Visibility for Non-Monogamy, which is a global week of action dedicated to amplifying non-monogamous voices, identities, and experiences in order to dismantle stereotypes, promote acceptance, and to celebrate how far we've come as a movement. Now, tonight's event is one of more than 40 in-person and virtual events happening all around the globe. So head over to weekofvisibility.com to see them all. My name is Brett. I'll be moderating tonight's panel. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the founder and executive director of OPEN, the Organization for Polyamory and Ethical Non-Monogamy. We're a grassroots advocacy nonprofit working to advance legal rights and cultural acceptance for non-monogamous families and relationships of all varieties. And because we're talking about identity today, I'll share some of the identities that shape my life. I'm a queer, bisexual, polyamorous man. I'm also an activist and a vegetarian. And I'm joining you from El Cerrito, California, which we recognize as the traditional unceded territory of the Ohlone people. And I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's illustrious panel with my deep gratitude to all of them for joining us. We are joined tonight by Kevin Patterson, an active member of the Philadelphia polyamory community. He's been practicing ethical non-monogamy since 2002 after opening up a relationship that eventually became his marriage. And in 2015, he was inspired to start Poly Role Models, an interview series for people describing their experiences with polyamory. Poly Role Models was part of a drive and a desire to change the way our lives and communities are viewed. And Kevin continued that discussion about polyamorous representation by writing Love's Not Colorblind, Race and Representation in Polyamorous and Other Alternative Communities. Along with co-writer Alana Felon, Kevin launched this sci-fi novel series For Hire that centers characters of color as well as other marginalized identities. So welcome, Kevin. William Winters is a seasoned digital campaign strategist for progressive organizations and causes. He's also a leader in the Bay Area sex-positive and polyamorous communities as the founder of Bonobo Network, a sex-positive, consent-focused, power-aware community that facilitates well-informed, emotionally sophisticated, inclusive, and curated conversations and praxis about sex and intimacy. He's also a founder of Express Yourself, a quarterly gathering uniting people of color in celebrations of the erotic, and is president of OPEN. Alyssa Gonzalez is a public speaker, a science writer, biology PhD, and author of Non-Monogamy and Neurodiversity. When she isn't writing about advances in agroeconomics, I don't think I pronounced that right. Agregenomics, Alyssa, you may have to correct me there. She's putting her recipes, urbanist rants, and essays about her experiences as an autistic, ex-Catholic, Hispanic, transgender immigrant to Canada on her blog, The Perfumed Void. She also writes speculative fiction that explores social isolation, autism, gender, trauma, and the relationships between all of those. She lives in Ottawa, Canada, with a menagerie of pets. And finally, Dr. Michelle Vaughn, PhD, is pansexual polyamorous woman, a licensed clinical psychologist, and a clinical full professor in the School of Professional Psychology at Wright State University, as well as a fellow of the Division 44 of Division 44 of the American Psychological Association. She trains health providers in sex, gender, and relationship affirming practices as part of culturally humble trainings and conducts her strengths-based scholarship on LGBTQ+ and consensual non-monogamy. Her most notable works include the first published peer-reviewed study of physical healthcare experiences of CNM individuals and the first published measures of compersion and stress-related growth from the home coming out process for sexual minorities. She's the co-editor and co-author of the Handbook of CNM Affirming Mental Health Practices, in addition to serving on regional and national CNM organizations and training medical and mental health professionals on LGBTQ+ strengths and CNM affirming practices. So as you see, we have a fantastic panel with a lot of incredible experience and so much to share. I'm really looking forward to diving into tonight's conversation. So to start, this being a conversation about identity and inclusion, I want to go around to all of our panelists and invite them to share any identities that they hold that inform their work. So why don't we start with Kevin? I muted all you speakers if you want to come off mute there. Hi, Kevin.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. My name is Kevin Patterson. The identities that are really important to me is black. I'm black. I'm very, very black. Like I'm also queer, but that's a relatively new thing, like in the last quarter of my life. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it outside of like situations where it's like active and applicable. So yeah, I just talk about my blackness. That's the identity that's most important to me.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Moving to you, Dr. Vaughn.
Sure. I think what feels salient and how those pieces go together is definitely my queerness, my identity as a woman that's also cisgender. Certainly trying to hold and always be mindful of my whiteness and the privileges I hold in the world with education. I'm also a first generation college student. I was raised in a rural environment, which sometimes has a very cultural piece for me. And thinking about class too, as someone who has finally become upper middle class for where I live. So those feel salient, and certainly being a psychologist and a professor is very meaningful to me, but often, an invisible piece, an acquired identity.
Thanks for sharing. How about you, Alyssa?
Stuck a list in my intro, but I can do a proper list now. I'm autistic, transgender, lesbian, polyamorous, atheist, an immigrant, a lover of language, an avid aquarist. You're looking at the biggest one, but there's three others. Yeah, those are the big ones.
Thanks for sharing. What was that word again? An aquarium enthusiast? Is it aquarist?
Aquarist.
Aquarist.
And the one from earlier is agrigenomics.
Thank you. Can you define that one for me?
The use of genomics techniques in the context of agriculture, collecting information about the genetic makeup of farm animals, like farmed plants, that kind of thing, and seeing how they can be improved.
Awesome. Thank you. See, we're learning already. How about you, William?
I am Black. I am a Southerner. I am I grew up in a rural environment, and I also grew up pretty poor, especially in my early life. And so I think all of those really inform how I move through the world.
Well, thank you all for sharing. And I think what all those identities really illustrate is that all of us hold many identities. Some of those are intrinsic, they're part of how we were born. Others are maybe more assumed, whether those are our hobbies or our parental status. Our identities can shift over the course of our life. And of course, some identities have a lot more weight in our society. They can impose all sorts of systemic challenges and significance, whereas others might be more important to our individual life, our hobbies or our parenthood status. But might not have the same systemic weight. So I want to invite all of us to reflect on the identities that we hold and start to think about the ways that they shape our life experience and our experience of non-monogamy. So I want to turn first to Dr. Vaughn and help us establish just a bit of a foundation for this conversation. So I wonder if you could provide just a bit of a conceptual overview for how people's intersecting identities can inform their lived experience and their experience of non-monogamy.
I'll try to make it as least academic as possible. And certainly I want to open it to folks to speak to their experience where this may not apply or may not be true for you, right? So a lot of what we talk about with intersecting identities, everyone has identities, everyone's identities intersect and interact. But of course, in society, some folks are given social privileges and power, right? And you can't just dismiss that, right? Those things interlock in really interesting ways. So I like to think it through a framework of who's experiencing systematic oppression and in what ways, and there might be other ways in which they have power. So those are really complicated, and how they shift and interact sometimes is very visible. If it's a visible characteristic, it's something people guess about you or think they understand, but a lot of that is really invisible. And all those experiences can be sources of strength and also ways in which folks experience oppression. So everyone's story about how those other things interlock together is really unique and shaped by how those pieces interlock and how salient those pieces are. Is that what you're looking for? Is a good overview?
I think that's a great overview. I mean, it's certainly a weighty question.
Yeah.
Sticking with establishing some maybe vocabulary foundation, I want to kick over to Alyssa. For
Mhm.
folks that may not be familiar with this term, I wonder if you can unpack the concept of neurodiversity.
Okay. Welcome, naughty children. It's info dump time. Uh, Neurodiversity, as coined by Harvey Bloom in 1998, is the idea that there is a spectrum of natural variation in how human minds work. There isn't one right way for human neurology to work, but rather a whole range of possibilities that can enrich our society and experience. This concept is part of a larger push to avoid medicalizing things that aren't intrinsically harmful and to accept differences as simply part of our world and ourselves. The term's earlier uses tended to focus heavily on autism, and even current ones tends to maintain that, but it's usually held to be broader than just autism, encompassing additionally ADHD, borderline personality, dissociative identity, post-traumatic stress, and lots of other ways that a person's mind can be different from the norm. Since it always comes up, neurodivergence is a younger term coined by Kasiane Sasumasu and people in their orbit around 2000, and refers to a distance from the neurotypical norm. So the two concepts there are necessarily in conversation with each other. It adds an extra refining touch to the language around neurodiversity by providing a specific way to acknowledge that there is a common privileged mental class, if you will, and whose attributes in some sense provide the baseline from which the differences of the rest of us are recognized. I can keep going, but I feel like that might be enough.
Thanks, Alyssa. That's a great overview. And I know see a number of people in chat are saying we love a good info dump. So I enjoyed that because a lot of other folks did as well. I want to drill in on that just a little bit more. You touched on some of this in your response there, but as you mentioned, the language around neurodiversity and neurodivergence is a pretty important reframe, a fairly recent reframe as well, that sort of reconceptualized neurodiversity or neurodivergence from conversations around disability or mental illness even, and instead moved it to a part of someone's identity. So I wonder if you can chat just a bit about how neurodiversity or neurodivergence can inform someone's sense of identity.
Oh, absolutely. So there are a lot of ways that being mentally different can be a challenge in life, and not just in the other people are weird about it sense that is too often pathologized all by itself. But even when it's not making life harder, it's almost always making life different in ways that people with the same label can recognize and understand. My autism isn't a mere suitcase of problems and quirks I carry around with me to be left in a psych ward somewhere when they finally cure me. That's neither possible nor desirable. It's foundational to how my mind works, how I process information, what my sense of time feels like, how I form connections between ideas, how I process pleasure and pain and smell and taste and light and dark. There's not one piece of my life that the fact that I'm autistic doesn't touch. More than I'm an immigrant or Hispanic or a person who likes having fish tanks around, I'm autistic, and being autistic affects how I experience all of the previous and everything else in this life. And it's similar for other kinds of neurodivergence. Most of them have profound impacts on how we navigate this world, impacts that are not uniformly negative, or whose negative impact has the neurotypicals are mean about it as an intermediate step. Indeed, being neurodivergent often comes with positives that the mainstream tends not to recognize at all, unless it can turn them into party tricks or stigmatize them in some other way. The one that I don't think I'm ever going to forget was a paper by researchers named Hu et al. In 2021 that famously found that autistic people were more likely to adhere to their professed morals, even in private situations where they could gain by breaking them. And they concluded that this was evidence of pathological inflexibility on the part of the autistic people. Because the alternative was that there's a hypothetical situation somewhere in the human experience where we might be better than other people, and you just can't have that in their very medicalized model where there is neurotypical, which is good, and there's everything else, which is a problem. And the language of neurodivergence and neurodiversity alike aim to challenge that kind of thing, which even in extremely recent papers is still just how the mainstream likes to think about people like us. It's really distressing how this is still happening, and it's so important to them that being one of us be all bad, but it's not. But those of us living this life can plainly see that it isn't. People that know us and closely can see that it isn't, and we're not going anywhere. And when something about a person, it seems largely immutable, isn't all bad, and lots of other people go through it too, that's where community and identity happen.
Yeah, that's a really illustrative example, that study that you shared. And you're doing such an incredible job of teeing up the next question that I have on my script here, because you mentioned the importance of community. That's the question I want to ask next as we continue to build the foundation for this conversation, because the title of this panel is Identity and Inclusion in Non-Monogamous Communities. So I want to turn to you, William, as a community leader. And we've had the chance to speak together a number of times. You often talk about the importance of community. So wondering if you could just give an overview of what is community and why is it so important for certainly everybody in the human experience, but non-monogamous people in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So community, I think there are lots of different ways of slicing community. I think that there are communities of interest where you're basically grouping people according to the things that they care about, essentially. And then I think there's like community in like the sort of common use, which is like a collective of people who who uh like when things go wrong, you can broadly expect that like somebody's going to have your back, where there's like real relationships, not just transactional relationships. um um where there's mutual interest, where there's investment, where there's depth, where there is the possibility of repair in the face of relational ruptures. I think that all those go into community. I think that like sometimes when we start looking at the E&M world, people describe what I think might more properly be thought of as themes as communities. And I think that like they share some qualities for sure, a scene and a community, but they're not exactly the same thing. Like I think that there's a quality of like depth, in a depth of relationship, uh, um, and a sort of breadth of relationship across like the sort of particular like node, like super nodes of a network, social super nodes of a network, um, that define a community over a scene. So yeah, I think that the word community sometimes gets overused, but yeah, I do think that like when it comes to E&M, community, like having a like real community around it is, I think, a real key to success. When I first moved to the Bay Area from Louisiana in 2008, as like a polyamorous person who opened my relationship living in Louisiana, like it was such a lonely experience there. And there just like weren't the same kinds of opportunities to level up my own like relational skill, to really like meet my partner and partners where they needed and wanted to be met, to figure out my own like boundaries and desires, in systematic ways and not just like haphazardly. Like those opportunities just didn't exist in the same way when I was there. And so when I got to the Bay, like moving to finding community like just supercharged my practice of polyamory, and it happened, nearly overnight. And yeah, I'm just so grateful for what community has offered.
It's a beautiful thing. It's central to the human experience, but unfortunately can be quite elusive. Not something that we really center and value much. I appreciate your work building community here in the Bay Area. I know I've certainly benefited from that. So, Kevin, I want to turn to you. Your book, Love's Not Colorblind, explores some of the challenges that people of color can encounter in the dating world and in non-monogamous communities. So I wonder if we could, zoom into that and start unpacking some of the challenges that people can experience on the basis of their identities, particularly marginalized identities and particularly race in the U.S.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't hear a question, but I'm listening.
Sorry, could you unpack the sort of core thesis of your book and talk a bit about some of the challenges that people of color can encounter in non-monogamous communities?
Okay. So to rewind like all the way back to like childhood. So when you're Black in America, uh race and like race and race-based oppression, that's not really a class you take. You just pick up on it. You pick up on it because it's the air you breathe around you. You pick up on which one of your friends are being treated differently than you're being treated. You pick up on all that stuff, like something as simple as someone might treat me away and I'll bring it up with my friends. And granted, this is grade school. Like, yeah, I got treated such and such a way. It's such and such a place. And my Black friends would be like, yeah, me too. And my white friends would be like, wow, that's fucked up. But they wouldn't have any personal experience. So you pick up on it really quickly, really easily, just by, through osmosis. And so like by the time you're 16, 17, 18, you could write like a whole thesis on race-based oppression, and you can pick up on it, you can clock it really easily. So 20 something years ago, my wife and I went on into our polyamorous adventure, and eventually we found community. And we're in the Philadelphia area. We started finding like local meetup groups, movie nights, potlucks, poly cocktails, those kind of events. And we realized really quickly that a lot of that same oppressive bullshit was there as well. Like there's a lot of really enlightened feeling about polyamory. Like you're off the rails. You're not, not off the rails in a negative way, but like you're off the beaten path. You're doing your own thing. You're charting your own course outside of the mononormative culture that you're in. And so like a lot of people feel really, really enlightened about themselves, and that's cool. But like also the same oppressive bullshit that exists in general exists in polyamorous communities as well. And I didn't want to lose polyamory. Like this was like really early in the journey. So I'm still thinking that I'm like somehow cheating at life by doing this thing that other people aren't doing. And I didn't want to lose that. So instead of like backing out and being like, you know what, some of this shit's racist and I got to get out of here, I was like, well, I'm going to start asking questions. I'm going to start talking to people. I'm going to start making a stink about this. I got to find a way to make a stink without making so much of a stink that I stop getting invited to events, that I stop being welcome in places. But I started talking about it as much as I could, like at party, in as tactfully as I'm capable of, which, I've been pretty I'm pretty tactful when I can be. And so I would just start talking about this stuff until people had to start listening. First in the Philadelphia community, we changed the way our leadership was took form. We changed the way that our local polyamory groups were centered. It wasn't just me, it was a group effort. There were a lot of other people, but like I was definitely the person banging the drum the loudest. And at some point, uh, Rebecca Hiles, the Frisky Fairy online, was like, "Hey, you're talking about this a lot. You should be talking about this in educational spaces." And next thing you know, I'm speaking at this conference in Chicago, local conference here, dating and sex and dating and love and relationship conferences, and I found myself being like one of the only people talking about race at a lot of those conferences. That's not the case anymore. Like it's a very common topic. But at the time it felt like I was breaking ground. I didn't intend to. I figured I'd be one of several, but it felt for a while like I was one of one. Love's Not Colorblind came out in March of 2018, and it was born from all of that. It was born from like me just wanting to have these conversations and wanting to like have people listen to me and like and make adjustments to what the community looked like and who the communities were welcome to, but also because I needed some validation out of it. Um, the speaking engagements that I did leading up to the book, the best part of those for me was the validation, to be honest. Like I'd say like, hey, I went through this situation, and then somebody would raise their hand and say, hey, I also went through that situation, you know. And then there'd be a white person who'd raise their hand and be like, oh fuck, I did that to somebody, like not to you or the other person who raised their hand, but now now that I know that this thing that I did that I thought was welcoming and friendly, now that I know that that was taken poorly, and that's why this person maybe never got back to our community, you know, I wanted to open those eyes. I wanted to figure that out.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So, one of the things you mentioned a couple of times is that these are experiences that, folks with privileged racial identities, generally white people, don't have directly. So I'm wondering, could you give maybe a couple examples of the types of experiences, we might call them microaggressions or even more overt aggressions that you and others have experienced in some of these community spaces?
I mean, like the very first community event I went to was like a what's it called a meet and greet, like a social at a local club, and excuse me. And within about 5 minutes of being there, somebody made some joke, and I don't even remember all of what it was. Like real talk. Like for every instance of like hardcore racism that I could bring up in my life, there's like 20 that I've forgotten, or at least I don't remember the instance, but I remember how it made me feel. But I'm at this event, I'm at this little social. It feels like my OkCupid feed had all emptied into a single venue. So I was excited to actually meet, some of these folks in person. And next thing you know, somebody makes some joke, and it takes me out of the night entirely. Um, and I'm looking around and I'm like, all right, there's like 30, 40 people here and maybe like four black folks. And Philadelphia is hella black. Like it's four black folks here, and three of them came here in my car. It was like me, my wife, and like a guy that she was dating, you know? So I get really upset by this. I take some time and I'm like, you know what? I could leave this place. I'm upset, but also I don't want to lose the ability to do this thing that I want to do. I don't want to not be polyamorous. I don't not want to meet community. I'm going to stay away from those people or anybody that makes me feel in that way. And I just sort of like sucked it up because I have enough of a thick enough skin for that. But not everybody does, and not everybody should have to. Not everybody's going to feel that way. Some people are. A lot of the other people of color there, including like the one other black person that didn't arrive in my car, they stopped showing up to community events entirely. I don't know if that was the reason, but I know that didn't help, you know? So like there was always things like that. There were always times where I've got to do the metrics in my head of like I'm dating someone new and I can tell that they want to be with me. But also I'm getting the hint that they might not want to be seen with me. Is that in my head? Let me do more research. And if it's what I think it is, let me exit this situation, because that's a thing that's happened enough times. Like I'm a fully formed human being. I've got a lot of, I've got interests and hopes and dreams and motivations, but also I'm black. And if you think that me being black is the only thing I bring to a space, which was the impression that I would get enough times to like to think about it, to write about it, then there's a disconnect here in how you see me and what you see in me and what you see in community. So yeah, like Love's Not Colorblind was just me was me talking about it. And it's the reason why I have a lot of other people's voices in Love's Not Colorblind. I tell a lot of stories, I use a lot of analogies, I get a lot of quotes from other people who are dealing with the same thing, because it's not just my story. Like, I wrote the book, but it's everybody's story. It's everybody's story who's ever felt the touch of race-based oppression, you know? So like, it's, yeah, that's Love's Not Colorblind. That's what inspired it.
Thanks for sharing a bit about the background there, and your own experiences that informed it. William, I want to turn back to you, as a community leader yourself, and also someone that's done your own organizing around social justice and racial justice specifically. I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add about some of the barriers and experiences of marginalization that people of color can experience in non-monogamous community spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess like one thing that I often think about is the ways that uh like these communities, I mean, as Kevin said, as much as, you know, they and we often want to think of ourselves as like enlightened in particular ways, like we're still going to be like microcosms of the wider world, you know, and wider, not whiter. Um, and you know, that means that like when you are building a community, like even if you're like, you know, uh pretty conscious, even if you're pretty lefty, even if it's like meant to serve like a particular identity group or some identity groups, um, like we can't pretend that we can get outside of the systems that like, you know, constrain us and harm us like in the world at large, you know. Like those systems are still going to show up, and like the trauma of like being people who live in those systems is going to show up, you know. And like like we still have to deal with that relationally in the spaces that we create, you know. um like sometimes like white organizers in the Bay Area would come to me and be like, William, like, you know, how do I, you know, make my community more diverse? You know, like how do I get more people of color in my community? And I'm like, oh well, that's easy. Solve racism, you know. Because like if like the point at which you're like engaged with like the problems of separation is like at the gates of like the local sex cult, then you know, you're probably looking a little bit too far downstream, you know. Like it's like the problem is way more upstream, you know, than like your organization, you know. And so I think that like which isn't like to say don't do anything about your organization, but it is to say that like as the organizer of a particular group, you have to be extremely intentional, um and more than a little bit lucky, frankly, to be able to like really meaningfully overcome the like disadvantages baked in by like housing patterns and you know like things that are the result of policies that were passed decades before you started doing your little polyamory club, you know. And so that's just like one like really important like piece of perspective that I like to give people, because I think that like when you look at the problem as like, oh, this is a problem that's like not just about like my polyamory club, but like actually about like being engaged with the wider world, like being a citizen, being someone who's like actually like engaged and invested in politics, then you know I think it actually like it has the benefit of both like taking the pressure off of like an organizer to feel like they must suddenly be responsible for the like all of the previous sins of the world, and at the same time it also empowers the organizers to like engage in like I think the really big solutions, like really big thinking about solutions and the effective stuff, which is like being involved in your community, going to city council meetings and voting and being an activist in the ways that you're an activist or whatever, and like not like having that sort of like navel gazing effect at the particular container of the community that you're in. So that's like one piece of perspective that I really like to bring to the table. The second thing that I think about a lot is like the ways that sometimes like in a black city like Philadelphia, or in a black city like Oakland, for that matter, the reason that the way that what I found in my personal experience talking with folks um, is that like sometimes there are meaningful barriers to access, that like prevent folks of color from participating, and those are I mean, you can do something about many of those. You can like choose to host your events in a different area or along a public transit line, or you can have like inclusive pricing and like those kinds of things. You can issue thoughtful messages saying that like folks from a wide range of like social identities are welcome in the space, and like be thoughtful about what that means when you say it and like really mean it, right? I think that like one of the things that I found though, even after doing some mix of various of those things over the years, is that like for some folks of color, and like in particular for some black folks I know, like being in even a plurality white space just like isn't the thing that's gonna make them feel good, safe, welcome, etc. And so like there is something about the and again that goes back to that even that goes back to like the sins of society way before you started organizing, and so in the Bay Area, what we did, me and another Black woman back in 2017, we created a party called Express Yourself that was an exclusively POC space. And that event was magical, and it was revelatory, and it's been going, more or less quarterly since then. And there are some transitions happening now. It's been a little break, but it's still kicking, which is really incredible. And I think that like one of the things that like majoritarian or even like sort of plurality like organizations can do is like take their resources, take their experience, etc., and support organizers who are interested in like seeding spaces, building spaces, that are like really speaking to folks with like particular identities, to have like caucus spaces to build power and comfort and skill and and capacity and yeah, just like all of those things, like because yeah, I mean, I think that the reality is that there are still like some number of folks of color in the Bay Area who would rather not engage with Bonobo, but would engage with something the complexion and shape of Express Yourself.
Wow, a lot of juicy wisdom there, William. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I really appreciate the focus on upstream solutions. I think that's something that when I worked in the environmental space, working on plastic pollution, we constantly hit this point. And I think that it's really relevant across a whole range of issues that while individual action and local community action is important, it's looking at the upstream systems that produce these outcomes or produce the context within which we are trying to organize more locally or live our lives individually. That's where the real, generational solutions occur. And I also see from the chat, I've heard such great things about Express Yourself. This intentionally cultivated space feels necessary and validating. Before we dig deeper into solutions, I do want to make sure that we turn back to Alyssa. And Alyssa, I want to ask you a similar question. What are some of the barriers and the challenges that neurodivergent people might encounter in non-monogamous spaces?
Well, the obvious one is that there's still a lot of stigma, misunderstanding, and confusion around neurodivergent people and our needs and patterns. Even when folks think they're not hostile to us, when they're rigid or mean about things they consider weird, that ends up hitting us more often than not. Whether that means we get desexualized entirely or treated as convenient freaks to dump excess energy into, it's dehumanizing, and it can do serious damage to the recipient's mental health, to say nothing of their interest in continuing to go to a place where they're treated that way. Let's see, I have more. Yeah, more specifically, non-monogamy is a process very often of deconstructing one by one various norms we inherit from a world that doesn't tend to operate that way. And these norms can sometimes be comforting pillars of order in a messy world for a lot of people. A lot of us depend on having a few rock solid definitions and axioms that we can lean on when trying to understand a bewildering world full of weird traps and messy neurotypical dishonesty. Seriously, the neurotypicals have no idea how often they say things they don't mean. It's incredible. Questioning and adjusting those pillars of order, even things as inconvenient as once you're married to someone, you're not allowed to be in love with anyone else. That can make it hard to understand how anything works anymore once you don't have something that foundational to lean on, and that can be scary. And on a less abstract level, a lot of us neurodivergent folks experience rejection-sensitive dysphoria. This experience turns essentially any rejection or even criticism into a mental catastrophe that can feel like a wholesale referendum on a person's value. It's really unpleasant and uncomfortable to deal with, and that's bad enough in everyday life when people will right or wrongly tell you you've messed up in various ways, and you have to process and live with the massive adrenaline spike every single time. But non-monogamy both shrinks the dating pool dramatically and makes it more likely that a person with one partner is going to keep looking for another one. And that magnifies both the possibilities and the costs of rejection. And it also creates a slew of additional communication challenges that might induce one of these dysphoria episodes. For someone who deals with this, being non-monogamous can be a lot more challenging than it otherwise would be. I can do a lot more, but y'all are going to have to read my book.
Read the book. And I see from the chat as well, somebody mentioned sensory overstimulation too. I've been to non-monogamous mixers or play parties where even as a neurotypical person, I'm like, wow, there's a lot going on here. Dr. Vaughn, I want to turn to you and invite you to comment on the concept of minority stress, right? So we've heard a lot about how people that have minority identities or marginalized identities can experience, recurring othering or rejection within kind of normative society. And we know from the clinical data that imposes a real mental health cost on people. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to the clinical research around minority stress.
Sure. So that phrase comes from Elon Meyer, who's a psychologist and a gay man who developed this theory originally to talk about gay men's experiences and then lesbian women, and then starting to expand a bit. So kind of trying to talk about how messages get internalized from society about being a member of a marginalized group, specifically around sexual orientation and then gender diversity later on. The types of stress you experience, including all the stuff that happens internally from living in a hostile world. So most people think of things like discrimination in an explicit way or acts of violence. But what we've learned, at least in terms of sexual orientation and gender diversity, is usually the things that predict negative mental health comes the worst are internalizing society's messages about yourself, right? So that principle most likely applies to lots of other marginalized groups as well, right? And folks who live at lots of intersections, but like believing, oh, maybe I'm not worthy of this. Maybe I am unlovable. Also waiting for bad shit to happen to you, anticipating rejection, anticipating discrimination, having to think about always, do I tell these people? Do I let these people who I know who I am? Do I decide not to? It takes a lot of energy. So it's a way of kind of looking at both the impact of external things happening as stressors, but also the internal stress processes that have from being a marginalized person in the world. And certainly some applications have been made for other groups as well. But in there is also a discussion of what serves as resources, how do you cope with this? Dr. Maya and I did work on a paper together about it for applications for for queer folks as well, and like what strengths people bring to the table. And that of course includes your community, your support, communal strengths as well as individual strengths to help you deal with the bullshit that comes from being a member of a marginalized community, to be a little more colloquial. That gives a little overview.
Thank you. Yeah, well, let's stick with this and let's turn this pivot and start talking about resilience and inclusion and strength, because one of the topics that you write about, Dr. Vaughn, is stress-related growth. So I'm wondering if you can explain that concept for us.
This is the idea in anything people subjectively find stressful, right? It is more than you think you can easily handle. There's both the opportunity to be harmed by that stressful experience, including experiences of marginalization, which is stress every day. But there is also an opportunity for growth. It's not either or. One doesn't cancel out the other. But for some folks, when they're challenged and stressed, that also creates a situation where they might discover new things about themselves. They might discover new things about what's important to them. They might also make other positive changes that might be hard, right? So that idea in any experience of stress, there's also what it can teach you and what you can learn from it. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Kevin, I want to turn to you with this question about resilience. I think people of color in the US have been forced to express a great degree of resilience. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about some of the ways that you've seen people of color create resilient communities.
I mean, a lot of it is taking was it taking lemons and making lemonade. It's something that I absolutely love about being Black in America. Like we understand that the world around us targets us. We understand that the world around us is unforgiving and unwelcoming, and we turn that into music. We turn it into media. We turn it into dances. We turn it into culture that the rest of the country consistently rips off and tries to repackage. And for everything that gets stolen from us, we just have a new thing that we come up with, that we create. A lot of it is laughing to keep from crying. A lot of it is defense mechanism. And as long as we can keep making that, as long as we can keep doing that, as long as we can keep finding new ways to find joy in the pain, you know, like in the, what's it called? I ended up hosting a movie night for the local polyamory community, and I said, like, this is going to be a black centered sort of POC exclusive thing. And I remember we're watching what is that Netflix show, She's Gotta Have It, the Spike Lee show. We didn't enjoy the show generally, but I remember, like, there was an episode where there was like there was a police encounter. And I remember I had an anxiety attack. And I'm not an anxiety attack guy. Like, my anxiety attacks are few and far between, but I'm watching this police encounter on a TV show, and I had a really, really negative reaction to it. And I remember thinking, like, if I'm going to have people seeing me freaking out like this, I'm glad it's people who understand why I'm freaking out like this. People who don't have to ask me a bunch of questions, but people who will hand me a drink and make it into a joke 20 seconds later after I've calmed down a second. People who get the pain and make the joke because they know that I'll get the joke. The just it's either that or not survive, to be honest with you. Like, that's the resilience. The resilience is either we're living or we're dying, and we've made a choice. The world's going to treat us poorly, but fuck y'all, we're going to do it anyway.
Alyssa, you also write in your book about some of the unique strengths that neurodivergent people might have. Can you talk a bit about some of the strengths that neurodivergent people can bring to the table, similar to what Kevin shared about being communities of color?
Absolutely. So I mentioned earlier that losing access to convenient axiomatic touchstones can be challenging for some of us, but on the other hand, one of the classic neurodivergent experiences is the sense that the mainstream's rules and patterns are obviously not meant for us, and they aren't. They're often awful fits for how we think and move through the world, and they're a reason we find ourselves in countercultural niches so often. That we often naturally flag places where the mainstream's rules don't seem to be quite working for anyone, including the people they're ostensibly designed to serve. And we end up seeking to find or build places that operate differently. And non-monogamy, where there is no grand social edifice to plug into or norms to plug and play the way there is for the standard monogamous approach that our society enforces, is an opportunity to deliberately create a different set of norms and patterns, one that actually fits us. And I think we're more likely to succeed at that than a lot of other folks who might try this. And I think we're also much more likely to realize it needs to be done in the first place, because we're so used to rules for the mainstream just being obvious nonsense as far as we're concerned. Coming at this from the other direction, something that has made non-monogamy an especially good fit for me is that I value my independence very highly. After a ruinous relationship that lasted far too long, I find no appetite for merging living spaces with someone else anymore. Many of us learn young and dearly that having any say over how our lives look at all means denying other people that privilege in whatever ways we can manage. Because anyone else with power over how our lives look will use it to dismiss, belittle, or act against our needs, and then tell us that we're not allowed to have a problem with that because their version is normal and ours is weird and wrong. The conventional relationship escalator is a nightmare scenario after that. Even if the other person doesn't think my household quirks are weird and wrong, some of them will still have to bend if we move in together, just as practical necessity. Their thoughts about my finances and vice versa will matter a lot more once my finances become our finances. Non-monogamous relationships aren't the only ones where people can sidestep this by not enmeshing the way ordinary society expects people to. And let's see, where was I? Sorry, I prepared a lot. But in non-monogamous relationships don't carry the same expectation that this is just what happens when a relationship lasts a certain amount of time, or the idea that it has to happen as proof that a relationship is serious, or any of that. Precisely because this is outside the mainstream, a lot of this is still fluid and negotiable and doesn't come weighed down with this is a default way to do things that we have to actively choose not to do. There's a lot more social space to build connections that matter to me and make them look how I want them to look, when we're already acting so far outside the pile of norms and heuristics that guide how the mainstream does things. So there's a lot of ways that being non-monogamous is a good fit for neurodivergence, and this is a good way that neurodivergence is a great fit for non-monogamy. And it is shocking how it works so well in both directions.
Thanks for sharing that, Alyssa. And yeah, I love that idea that when the sort of mainstream normative culture either isn't a fit for you or rejects you entirely, that there is both a need but also an opportunity to create new edifices, new communities, right? And I know that's been true for communities of color, that's been true for queer and LGBTQ communities. And in these spaces, there can be a real deep sense of solidarity and joy. I see somebody referenced in the comments, finding joy is what saved our spirits. And so that just really resonates with me. I appreciate you sharing that. William, turning back to you, as a community leader, kind of getting down into some of those nuts and bolts, practically speaking, what are some of the things that you and other leaders within the Bonobo community work to do to try and make your community as inclusive as possible for folks with marginalized identities of whatever type?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I think the first thing that we do is we try to recognize that those groups exist within the larger group, and we try to create spaces for them in our virtual gathering space. So there's like a space for groups of color and for folks of color in Bonobo. There's a space for neurodivergent folks in Bonobo. There is neurodiverse, that is. There's a space for queer folks, and specifically a space for trans folks and trans and non-binary folks. There is a space for sex workers in the community. I think that they're being able to create those spaces where folks can like gather and like engage with one another and find like sort of support and togetherness is like the sort of bare first step. I think that like policy wise, I mean, we do a lot of things like inclusive pricing in Bonobo. We have a pretty generous no one turned away for lack of funds policy to allow for ticket access across a really wide range of income levels from none to a lot, and that has worked out for us. I think really well. That served us really well. And yeah, those are like some of the things that we've taken on. And then I mean, with respect to express yourself, like express yourself doesn't live or hasn't up to this point like been part of Bonobo. There's been a sort of intentional choice on the part of the organizing team over the years to keep express yourself out of Bonobo. But Bonobo continues to like sort of like support that event with resources, things like getting to use our infrastructure, yeah, there's a kind of like side by side, like sort of symbiotic relationship there.
Awesome. Thanks, William. Dr. Vaughn, turning back to you and sticking with the subject of inclusivity generally, wondering how you would assess the state. This is a big question. I apologize, but I'm wondering how you would assess the state of the healthcare and mental health care systems specifically in terms of its inclusivity for people who practice non-monogamy, as well as folks with other marginalized intersecting identities.
So I'm here in the Midwest, so your experience may vary. But what I hear from folks from the research I did that was in, 2018, and also reading some of the scholarship on experiences in therapy, which is much broader than the experiences for kind of physical health care. Folks can have some good and inclusive experience, but it seems like the majority of experiences people have with those systems is the systems of healthcare are based in capitalist, hetero, cis, monogamous norms, right? Even getting to, I don't have to tell people here, getting to list more than one emergency contact, right? Including people in the room where it's a healthcare procedure, or you're doing family planning, right? Or you want to have an honest conversation with your physician about safer sex, or maybe PrEP or birth control. It really tends to vary a lot with folks, what their experiences are, what we see. And there's a lot of people kind of trying to hack, who do you go to? Who do you trust? Yeah, so those things come up. And then when that comes up on top of like, do you have private insurance? Is it decent? Are you trying to also navigate Medicaid systems? Are you trying to navigate low-cost clinics? So I see a wide range of experiences with folks, and of course that's going to interact with other identities you hold. So one of my colleagues does a lot of work on people in larger bodies and what happens and all the crap you get if you're a bigger person. And so all those things come, and people sometimes have pretty good experiences and sometimes really horrific experiences. Tends to be the things I've heard that are the most horrific and physically dangerous have been encounters in medical situations, a little more breadth of pretty good to pretty bad within therapy experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Open just completed our annual community survey. We collected over 4,500 responses from people around the world. One of the questions we asked was about experiences of stigma and marginalization in a range of domains. We also invited people to share their stories, and I was frankly shocked, even after years of doing advocacy in the space, the number of people that reported experiences like, my doctor wouldn't give me an STI panel because they know that I'm non-monogamous. My therapist insisted that my polyamory was the source of all my problems and tried to prescribe me medication for it. And so, yeah, it is shockingly persistent. Now, one of the solutions that you highlight in your work, Dr. Vaughn, is culturally humble training. So I'm wondering if you can explain that concept to us.
The idea of cultural humility as an approach to training healthcare providers or therapists actually comes from Black women working in the medical community. So they cultivated that dream. I'm trying to remember her name. It starts with a T to give original citations. Academic problems there. But this idea, it's not about memorizing things. It's not about you need to learn all these things and have a stereotype of folks from every group. It's about recognizing what you don't know. It is about when it's relevant to ask open questions, and it's about learning how to apologize and make it right when you screw it up or you make an assumption. And those principles being far more powerful, especially for intersections and unique experiences and terms that are new to you, than trying to memorize, I've got to do this for a person with this identity, right? Mm-hmm. So it is doing your homework and educating yourself, but it's learning how to say, we had a couple folks back in the medical study, good providers that said, oh, I don't know too much about that. Like, are you comfortable working with me while I try to figure it out and do right by you? People are like, hey, that's okay. Or, hey, is this, this seems a relevant question. This seems useful. I would suggest that. How does that fit for you? So just having that humility. So that is a really important piece, I think, of lots of training and working with folks that are culturally different than you, and can be part of anti-oppressive services and inclusiveness, but also kind of a good practical bit of principles. I think a lot of people can come in, and I think it could apply to leadership too. I think culturally humble leadership might be somebody I'm sure is writing about that. Might be some overlapping principles, I hope.
I love that. That's exactly what I was thinking as you said that. Like, oh, I really like that phrase. I think I might need to use that because, of course, as William shared earlier, there are big systemic upstream challenges, and also sometimes the way that we just relate on an individual level can be a really important place that these solutions can start to emerge. Kevin, I want to turn back to you and ask you your thoughts on what community leaders can do to create more inclusive communities.
Well, generally, I always say like ask questions, question the space, but organizers, community leaders, in specifically, ask who's not in the room. Like they're and it's something I reference a bunch of. Southwest Love Fest it's an event out in Tucson that I've been to a few times this year as well. They have a childcare space, which is something I almost never see at like polyamorous or relationship or sex ed conferences. A childcare space, and it was just as simple as one of the founders having a kid and needing childcare. And was like, okay, this is a concern for me. I'm going to make sure it's a concern I address for our community. And that's not a thing that every organizer does. A lot of organizers are just excited to be organizing. They're excited to have an event. They're excited to be doing something. but they're not questioning who's there and who's not. They're not questioning who's making the decisions. They're making the decisions. But sometimes you don't know like you don't have all the answers. You don't know what questions to even ask. You know, I am a cis guy, and I know that if I'm planning something, there are gonna be a comment. Like, I'm cisgender. I'm able-bodied. Like I know that there are going to be questions that I don't know to ask. I know there are going to be accommodations that I would love to implement, but I don't know that they're needed until I ask something, somebody else, something else. So you got to question who's in the room, who's not in the room. When you're hosting something, when you have like an event, you have to look around and see like who's able to attend and who's not. You know, if if you're looking around and like certain people can't make it, like is this place accessible? Is this place how much does it cost to get here? How much does it cost to not just like to enter the space, but also to arrive? Is this place accessible by public transportation? If you're dealing with people who are traditionally marginalized by way of class, by way of finance, all of these things are going to factor in. Like if there's a cover charge, if there's no way to get there without a car, you're excluding people. You don't know that you're excluding people. You think you're just hosting a thing. But if people can't attend, if people can or won't or have so many feelings around attending, there are more questions to be asked. Like I'm going to I'm going to a local event next week, and they put it right there in the brochure that this is a fragrance free spot because one of the organizers has a fragrance allergy that like it's like a super severe fragrance allergy. So even though it's going to be the kind of event where people might typically wear perfume or like or scented lotions or what have you, body spray, body washes, we're not doing that because this organizer has an issue and decided to take it up with the whole community. So like what happens if this organizer doesn't have a fragrance allergy and doesn't come up with this solution? That means anyone who does have a fragrance allergy is unwelcome in that space, whether that's the intent or not. So you got to ask questions. You got to look and see, like, as an organizer, you've got to see who else is organizing. Are you organizing alone? How many, what other questions need to be asked? If you're someone who's just attending, I'm always like, question the space. Question the space if you are not on the business end of oppression. Whereas as a cis dude, I'm going to ask trans friendly questions because I don't want my trans friends to get ousted or made to feel unwelcome by raising the question themselves. I'm going to try to pick up on what their needs are by way of talking to them. And then I'm going to bring it up in a way that addresses it without putting them on the spot, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. There's a lot of great suggestions in there. And one piece I just want to briefly, pause on for a moment too is that of class, which you referenced with regard to ticket pricing and public transit, access, and William also referenced too. And I think that's really important because in much of the mainstream American culture, we don't talk about class, and yet it's an incredibly important determinant of people's life outcome. And we know in the US, due to generations of oppression, it is very correlated with race as well. So I just think that's a really important lens to bring to things.
And real talk, the reason why we don't discuss class in America is because the ruling class, the class of folks, like, I mean, like, I don't know if they still call them the one percenters. I remember that was the phrasing a few years ago, one percenters. Like, they're heavily invested in not discussing class. They're the people who are like, never discuss how much you're making at your job with your coworkers because they're the one paying you and your coworkers, and they don't want to have to pay everybody whatever the top dollar is. So they're like, never discuss that kind of stuff. Like, they're incentivized to not discuss it, and so they make us incentivized to not discuss it, because if we do discuss it, next thing you know, we break out the guillotines.
Bingo. Alyssa, I want to bring this question to you. What are some things that community leaders can do to create more accessible and inclusive spaces for neurodivergent folks?
No flashing lights.
Mm.
It's a list of medical conditions that can set off that are rather prevalent among neurodivergent people. Slightly less flippantly, probably the topmost thing that can be done to make a space welcoming for neurodivergent people is to establish a social norm where people in that space are just not allowed to be mean to people who are being harmlessly weird in public.
Mhm.
Like almost every other tip related in this matter comes down to a subset of this one, and I suspect it's a lot more broadly applicable than just in the matter of neurodivergence. Along similar lines, a lot of us do what's called self-stimulation, which sounds naughty but generally isn't. Just repetitive movements that help keep our minds focused, help us figure out how to exist in a body, even in an unfamiliar space. Like, unless those are like actively disruptive in some way, and they can be, just like ignore it. I've got multiple stim toys in my hands right now, and it's not bothering anybody. Like, all of that. There are a lot of terms specific to like neurodivergence and mental health. Like, one that comes up a lot because of how thoroughly the discourse about it has been poisoned is the idea of something being someone being triggered or something being triggering. Like, these are terms with important meanings for people that deal with the actual phenomenon they were meant to describe. So flippantly using these words in ways that are outside that definition makes it a lot harder for people who need their actual precise definitions to be understood. Another obvious one is way more explicit than you think you need to be about norms and expectations. Lots of things pass unspoken in neurotypical spaces that probably should be spoken there too, frankly. And if we want a space to operate smoothly for neurodivergent people that may not have picked up on an unspoken norm, or maybe relying on whatever instructions were provided to be reasonably complete, or who deal with substantial amounts of anxiety if there's information they want that they don't have, like that is very important. And also helps with cross-cultural communication in general if you want your group to have a relatively broad base of interest. Let's see. Along similar lines, if you encounter a person who is complying with the letter but not the spirit of how y'all want things to be done, like if you intend for your space to be welcoming to neurodivergent people, your go-to assumption for why that is cannot be malice. All right. More than that, you're gonna be dealing with competing access needs in any space with a sufficiently large number of disabled or neurodivergent people in it. There are ways to, if not meet everyone's needs, then establish a compromise that is comparably unpleasant to everyone affected and isn't singling out some group to be the one that isn't being helped. This is probably the hardest part, and the part where whatever solution is found is the least likely to be one that makes everyone happy, but it's important to put in the effort. There's some folks in the chat making a whole bunch of excellent suggestions in here. I'm a particular fan of encouraging the allistic people to take folks at their word and not presume the dense slurry of hidden meanings they like to reveal into what should be plain communication. Yes, please, more of that. It would make my job interviews a lot easier.
That's a great list of really concrete suggestions. I really appreciate you sharing those. And something I take away from that too is that so many of those can really benefit everybody in a community space, right? Particularly like let people be, as I think you put it, like do something that it might be perceived as weird, right? And I think that's essential for a good party, right? Like people should be able to let their freak flags fly, to do things that might seem vulnerable, and whether that emerges from a part of their neurodivergent experience and needs, or is just the way that somebody wants to show up in a space and experience the party or connect with other folks. I think that's something that really benefits everyone. And I think it points to the fact that when we create more inclusive spaces for people with particular needs or identities, we end up creating more more inclusive spaces and more joyous spaces for everyone. So as we draw to the end of our conversation here, I want to invite all the panelists to share their vision for the future of the non-monogamous movement and non-monogamous communities. Where would you like to see us in 10 years, in 50 years, and in 100 years? So why don't we start with William, since I know this is something I'm sure you've thought much about. In fact, we've talked about.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, in 50 years, we are really, like, this movement is really just beginning to conceptualize itself as a movement. Like, I think there's so much more work to do to get folks who think of themselves as polyamorous to also think of themselves as like political agents, or to think of like their polyamory as like a political dimension of their identity, along with the ways they might think that their race or their gender and other characteristics are a political dimension of their identities. Because the reality is that, like, this dimension is political, and it's been politicized, and and I think it's important to keep in mind that, like, the folks who oppose us, who, like, oppose our having rights, who oppose our having legal protections, have already politicized our identities and are gearing up to fight any progress that we might claw in the coming decade or so. So that's one thing. I imagine in 50 years, like, if I could snap my fingers and make it so, that our movement would be a powerful one, that we will have broad representation, broad representation in, like, media, that, like, when there is a non-monogamous love interest in television or fiction, that it's not treated as like some weird anomaly of a B plot, B subplot, that like there is like broad recognition. I mean, I hope that, like, in 50 years, that there will be states that will have, like, actually passed protections for non-monogamous folks who like, are just trying to live their lives, that, like, it'll be illegal to discriminate against us for the fact that we're not monogamy in different places. And so, yeah, those are just some of the things that, like, I would wish for in 50 years. I want to take up more space.
I love it. Let's get political. How about you, Dr. Vaughn?
I have two thoughts, and they're probably related together, but I don't know how to interlock them first. I'm actually slowly working on a new manuscript about how we can think about queerness and intimacy in ways that reject a lot of the norms that are cis and het and capitalist, and rooted in so many of these things, as well as whiteness. And so my hope is that there's a possibility for greater solidarity in thinking about intimacy and connection and kin in ways that we can think about shared experiences of marginalization, right? And that of course has, now that I say it out loud, of course has the context for activism and for rights and inclusion, instead of seeing these as separate issues, seeing them as part of the same systems of oppression in different little packages. Right? Whether we're talking about families of choice, or we're talking about abolishing the word relationship as some special status tied to romance or sexuality. I think there's the possibility for solidarity there, and deeper connection, and facilitating a better understanding of oppressions maybe each individual person doesn't have. So yeah, I connect those two ideas together somehow. Okay.
I love
That's
that.
all I have.
Yeah, I mean, if William's answer was let's get political, yours is let's get intersectional, which of course
Yeah.
should
Yeah.
be the same thing anyways. Kevin, how about you? Bring this question to you. Where do you see us in the future?
So I used to make, there was a joke I used to make at conferences. Like if I was speaking in Los Angeles, I would joke around and say, well, if there's a polyamory event in Philadelphia, it's all white because I'm here in Los Angeles. Ha ha ha. And that's no longer the case. Like I said, like I it was a group effort. I might have banged the drum the loudest, but it was a group effort. And now, like in Philadelphia, like that joke no longer applies. So like what I'd want to see for the future is people just keep plugging away, normalize and normalize and normalize. Because in the same way that if I built a car today, it would have to have a seatbelt. Like there was a time where that didn't exist. At some point, someone was like, people are dying. Let's put in a seatbelt. And then eventually every car had a seatbelt. Most cars have airbags. I'm hoping that we can normalize the conversations. We can normalize all of that questioning organizers, questioning the space, questioning what's going on here, questioning, what an event looks like, what it could look like. We do this until the questions ask and answer themselves, to the point where we no longer have to fight as hard to get things to look the way that they could and probably should look. Because it's not because when I talk about like Philadelphia being 40 something percent black, but the polyamory community didn't look like that, it looks closer to that now. And having that diversity of people brings diversity of thought, diversity of resources, diversity of ideas, diversity of solutions, to the point where the community looks and feels better for a wider range of people. And nobody's lost anything to make that happen. So I'm hoping we can normalize to the point where whatever random misconceptions about oppression in the polyamory community, whatever random that it looks different, or that the misconceptions go away to the point where everybody knows it, to the point where the stereotypes sort of wash themselves out.
Love that. Thanks for sharing. I'm reminded of the slogan, we do this till we all free, right? Like we keep pushing that ball forward. Finally, turning to you, Alyssa, where do you see us in the future?
In hard not to just blanket agree with all of my predecessors on this one. The matter of neurodivergence is interesting because it's my experience that we are wildly overrepresented in non-monogamous communities, where a lot of other marginalized groups are underrepresented. It's because this is true in almost every countercultural space, honestly, whether it's punk scenes, goth clubs, Renaissance fairs, any niche hobby group, like the one that I'm a big fan of over there. Where these groups have neurodivergent people well out of our proportion in the population, because we find every little out of mainstream niche and we fill it because the mainstream refuses to deal with us equitably and it can't hold us. Like, we're not an accident in this community, and I don't think it's going to be especially long before the sheer abundance of us in this space, even if we're still not the majority, it drags every polyamory group in the universe kicking and screaming toward dealing with neurodivergent people much more fairly. My pie in the sky dream is that by 50 years from now, it's actually the folks who are like, well, my ultra weird, strange kink that needs explaining is that I want you to not be attracted to, love, or marry anyone else, and the rest of us don't even need a word for what we are. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're moving that direction.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I want to go through one more round robin here and invite all of our speakers to share where folks can learn more about their work, connect with them. I have links to folks' books who have published books that I'll drop in the chat as well. So we'll go in the same order here. So kicking back to you, William.
Yeah. So I am the board chair of the Organization for Polyamory and Ethical Non-Monogamy, and you can find that work at open-love.org. And otherwise, you can find me via Bonobo Network BONOBO network.com.
Awesome. How about you, Dr. Vaughn?
Probably the things I've done that are most broadly applicable are through APA Division 44, the Consensual Non-Monogamy Committee, which is a permit standing committee. I'll put that in the chat. Resources, especially for training providers, guides for how to get your therapist to be like, these are the 4 things I need you to do and not do. So there's some great resources for providers and clients and patients to share, and just a little sense of what we're doing in terms of advocacy within the field of psychology.
Fantastic. And I'm going to drop here a link as well to buy the Handbook of Consensual Non-Monogamy from the publisher, and not from that other big company that starts with an A. Kevin, how about you? And I'm going to drop your link to buy your book, Love's Not Colorblind, from the Open Bookshop first. And then how else can folks connect with you and support you? Oop, you're muted.
All right, I'm putting it in the chat as well. But I'm Poly Role Models on everything. I'm Poly Role Models on Instagram and Facebook and PayPal and so on. But yeah, right now, I'm not working on anything brand new in particular. There's always like a book or two sort of in the works. Love's Not Colorblind is available. I've also got a series of queer polyamorous superhero novels with my co-writer Alana Phelan. It's called the For Hire series. There are 3 books in the series out now. That's Operator, Audition, and Supercell. There is a completely unrelated Netflix show called Supercell. I'm hoping that maybe I get some unrelated sales out of that towards my own superhero books, but who knows? Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But yeah, that's who I am, and that's where I'm available.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Dropping the link to Kevin's website, the books page of his website, where you can learn more about all of his books. And then finally, Alyssa.
Hi, you can find out more about me at alysacgonzalez.com. And there's a link to where you can buy the last few signed copies of my book. And you can also find my blog at the-orbit.net/Alyssa. I'll put that in there. Either of those should lead you to my Patreon before too long, so you won't have to chase down that URL very far. That's where I put my stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, Alyssa. And I'm glad you dropped the link in the chat, because I almost typed the and then the word -orbit. So I think I'm the one being too literal now. So thanks for sharing that. And finally, I want to thank everyone so much for joining. I want to thank all of our incredible panelists. This webinar recording will be posted. I'll try and pull all the links from the chat, and we also will have the auto-generated transcript, which I hope has been sufficient. As I mentioned, this is part of the Global Week of Visibility for Non-Monogamy, so I encourage folks to check out weekofvisibility.com, where you can find all the incredible virtual and in-person events that we have going on all week. And so I'd love for folks to check that out and join in the celebration. And finally, you can learn more and support Open's work advancing rights and acceptance for non-monogamous families and relationships by visiting open-love.org or open-love.org/join to join our email list, or /donate to make a tax-deductible contribution to support our advocacy work. So once again, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists for sharing your amazing wisdom. Thank you to our guests for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you all out there. All right, have a nice evening and take care, everyone.
Hey, good night,
Before we
everybody.
go anywhere, is the recording going to be accessible to others?
Yes, we will be sharing that via let me stop the recording now for a second.